Hello, and welcome to A New Road Ahead, Brexit and Export Controls by Customs Connect. I'm Alexandra Turner. I'm the head of Customs and Export Control Strategy for Customs Connect, and I'll walk you through what export controls is going to look like post-transition. So we're all familiar with the Brexit timeline that we have in place. We're coming to the end. We're almost out of post-transition. So as of 11 p.m. on the 31st of December for the UK, at midnight for the EU, we are officially out. So, what are export controls? Export controls are the regulations by governments over the tangible or intangible movements of products, software, including source code, and technology across national borders. This is either for non-proliferation, national security, foreign policy, or now increasingly human rights reasons. There are four types of controls. They're the controls over the items. These are the actual physical things or the intangible items, and these come from the control lists. These are not the tariff classification lists. These are their own particular lists that come from multilateral agreements. You also have the destination controls. These are what you see most of the time. These are the sanctions and embargoes in place. You also have the other two controls. These are the end use and end user. We're looking at what items are ultimately going to be used for, even though they may not be on the control lists, and also who they're going to. Are they denied or restricted parties? There are various export control authorities. In the EU right now, it varies by member state. In the UK, we have the Export Control Joint Unit. We also have HMRC, who is our enforcement authority. And then we have the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, or OFSI. They work with companies on the financial sanctions. Currently, right now, we are under the EU regulations for dual use. So we have EU Council Regulation 428/2009, which also includes the dual use list, and Council Regulation 1232/2001, and other various EU regulations, mostly sanctions that are in place. In the UK, we then implement these regulations through various acts and orders that are either issued by the ECJU or HMRC. We also have the EU Withdrawal Act at the moment. All these acts and regulations are going to stay in place with regards to the UK. They're just going to be amended and updated as needed, as we will take back full sovereign control. We've always had control over military controls in the EU, but once we come out post-transition, we'll also take control of the dual use as well. This is a slide that shows you currently all of the control lists that are in place. Thankfully, the UK is quite friendly in the fact that we have now the consolidated list, the one in blue. So we have a master list which contains everything in it that you can reference. And this will stay in place post-Brexit, so this will still be here. That list will be updated to reflect not only our military controls, but also the UK dual-use lists that will come from the multilateral regimes. So what does this mean for Brexit? Well, when Brexit comes into effect as of the 1st of January, national and customs borders between the EU and Great Britain will come up, which means that we're going to have a difference for dual-use controls, not necessarily for military, and I'll go into what that means. We also have the consideration of the Northern Ireland Protocol. We have this now dual system alignment for Northern Ireland with the EU, which is going to create slight differences between Great Britain and Northern Ireland in the way that it works for the dual-use products. Right now, the Northern Ireland Protocol is treating Northern Ireland as an EU member state with regards only to the dual-use regulation, and it'll apply to shipments that are coming into Great Britain from Northern Ireland. But overall, our UK export control framework is not going to change, and neither is the one on the EU side. What will change is what licenses we have in effect and some of the sanctions. Current licenses for exports to non-EU countries will remain valid from the UK. So if you're currently exporting, for example, from the UK to Australia and you've needed a license, the license you have in place will remain valid. That will not change post-transition. Current licenses we have for exports of military-controlled items to the EU countries will also remain valid. This has always been in effect. Military items have always been controlled from the UK national border. Export licenses now, post-transition, are going to be required for dual-use items that are leaving the UK, traveling to the EU and Channel Islands, and vice versa. Licenses that have been issued by the EU member states for exports from the UK will no longer be valid. You'll have to obtain a license in the UK for exports from the UK. And similarly, licenses issued by the UK authorities for exports from other EU member states will become invalid. You'll have to apply in another member state. UK sanctions lists and regulations are already available for you to see and will go live post-transition. They're quite similar right now to the EU, but there is a chance for divergence in the future. We currently have the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2018 that you can currently look at. Some considerations post-transition. For trade between the UK and the UK has set up an open general export license, specifically adding the EU as the destination. If you want to use an OGEL, you simply sign up for this license on the UK SPIRE system, the licensing system. But if you want to use this license, you will have to meet certain record keeping and government audit requirements. You'll have to make sure that you list your license on your customs documentation for export in box 44. And if you're dealing with category 0 nuclear items, there is potential for prior notification before you can export these items. Unfortunately, in the reverse, there is a proposal for the EU to add the UK as permitted destination under the Union General Export Authorization, which is almost the exact same type of license. But this hasn't currently been added. Hopefully this will be in the next few weeks. Companies will need to verify the regulations of the country in which they're exporting from. So because there could be a slight divergence in the requirements or licensing requirements or interpretation of certain rules, you'll want to make sure that wherever you're actually exporting from or the rules your products may be subject to, you've verified those regulations. And you've also taken a look at the ECCN classifications to make sure that there hasn't been any different interpretation or maybe potential difference in numbers between the two lists. You also may need to screen for various lists. Companies who operate in the UK, depending on who they're operating with or the types of activities they're conducting, may need to screen not only the UK lists, but also the EU denied and restricted party lists, and vice versa. It's the same way that many countries around the world have to screen for US lists. This may come into play going forward. So what can you do in this final countdown of 30 days? First, you need to verify the ECCNs you have for all of your products, tangible and intangible, going in and out of the UK and the EU, and make sure you have the correct classification under the appropriate list. In the UK, you need to register on SPIRE for the EU OGEL if you're going to continue exporting controlled products to the EU. And also, if you're in the EU, keep a lookout for that GEA to see if the UK gets added on so that you can sign up for that license. Determine which sanctions lists you need to screen against for your various transactions. Make sure your procedures have those considerations input into those procedures. And also verify that the screening tool you're using has signed up to these applicable lists. You'll want to make sure that the UK lists are going to be added into the system. Verify whether or not your supply chain is routing goods through Northern Ireland. You could become subject to the Northern Ireland Protocol without knowing it because your goods are being routed through. So you'll want to make sure with your brokers and your carriers which routing route they're going to take. Also analyze potential brokering controls. You may be involved in triangularized or drop shipment type operations where you're assisting sister companies. So you'll want to see, are what you're doing considered brokering activities, and if so, could it be controlled and require a license? Also verify your Incoterms. Which Incoterms are in place? Are you allowed to be the exporter? And if so, are you responsible for the licensing? And provide the licensing information for your brokers for the customs declaration. It's very important that they understand that the products that they're dealing with are controlled and licensed and should be documented as such. If you have any questions, please let me know and forward your emails on to info@customsconnect.co.uk for my attention. Thank you very much.